Hi students, we have just finished learning about the Articles of Confederation, and there were a few rocky years as the U.S. began its new government, but now it's time for the Constitution. Remember, the framers met behind closed doors, locked and guarded. They didn't want anyone to know that they were planning a brand new government, but they did. They rewrote the Constitution, completely started over, and today we'll talk about what that looked like, what the new plan was, and how it went into effect. Why was the new Constitution so major? Why was it important? The first important part about the new Constitution is that it was considered the supreme law of the land. That means that every other law that is made in this country, whether it's at the state level or the local level, must agree with the Constitution of the United States. It cannot go against it. That left the states room to make their own laws. It just meant their laws had to agree with what the Constitution says. They can't contradict the Constitution. Also, the Constitution allowed for a bicameral Congress, and that means that we have two houses. We have the Senate and we have the House of Representatives. The next problem that the framers had to figure out was how to count slaves. Of course, the southern states wanted slaves to count as one complete person. That would add to their population and they would get more House of Representatives members. But, of course, the northern states saw slaves as not a part of the political system, and they shouldn't count towards a southern state's population. In the end, they decided to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. Yes. A fourth important point about the Constitution is that there are now 3 equally powerful branches. Before, there was only the legislative branch. Now, there's the executive, judicial, and legislative. Each branch has checks and balances to make sure that the power is equally shared and no branch can become more powerful than another. That's the plan. And finally, government can only do what the Constitution says, and that is called limited power. Here are the 3 branches, and you can see what each branch does, what their powers are. You do not need to copy this chart, but you may want to revisit it later. Who led the Constitutional Convention? George Washington, who was not part of the Continental Congress when the Declaration of Independence was signed, is now part of the Constitutional Convention. Remember, during the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he was leading part of the revolutionary troops. But now he is available, and he helps by being the president of the convention. That meant that he presided over the meetings, and he often didn't enter the debates. He more led and helped to organize and hear each person's opinion. He was very strong in personality, and he had a lot of prestige. People really respected him because of his leadership during the Revolutionary War. The second person that we will think about whenever we think about the Constitutional Convention is James Madison. He is often called the father of the Constitution. Why? He was from Virginia. He was a brilliant political philosopher. And he often led the debates on the floor during the Constitutional Convention. He took a ton of notes, and those are the records that historians still turn to look at the accurate records of what happened during the Constitutional Convention. He also authored the Virginia Plan, which, as you know, set apart the idea of having 3 separate branches with equally shared power. And he later helped to write the Bill of Rights. This is a neat picture that was done, and you can see the curtains are closed here, but on this side the curtains are open. And that's indicating that they are done writing the Constitution and they are ready to share it with the public. While the meetings were being held and while they were still making decisions, all of the curtains were closed and the doors were locked, and it was very hot. In Philadelphia, it was a hot, hot summer, and they suffered through it to keep it a secret. Here are some folks in this picture that you may or may not recognize. There's George Washington. Alexander Hamilton, he will play an important figure later. Franklin. And Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania. Also, an important thing to note is that Thomas Jefferson is not in this picture because he was not at the Constitutional Convention. His ideas were very important, but he was in France, sent there as an ambassador representing the U.S. Franklin would later have that job, after Thomas Jefferson. Let's talk about which documents were the background for the Bill of Rights. First, there was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and that was written by George Mason. He wrote it for Virginia, and it confirmed those unalienable basic human rights. The second was the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. That was by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wanted to outlaw the established church in this document. And that meant that in Virginia, there would no longer be one religion that was favored by the government. These both helped to lead to the Bill of Rights, which, as you know, are the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution. You know that in the First Amendment, we are given our freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and those come directly from these 2 documents, along with many others. James Madison is considered the father of the Bill of Rights. He helped to write those using the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Here's a graphic to show you the Bill of Rights. This might also be something that you want to return to later. It's a nice way for you to see each of the amendments without having to read long and detailed legal wording. Alright, the next step is to talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They opposed one another during the Constitutional Convention. They had different ideas about what the government should be, how the government should operate, and how much power the government should have. Their ideas are still debated today in our modern politics. The Federalists advocated a strong central government, more power at the national level. They wanted the states to have less power. The national government, they said, should take care of problems at a national level, which meant that if they made a law, that would impact all of the states. They also wanted economic development at a federal level, and they wanted a national bank. So they wanted a bank that would control all the money, that would set rules for banking across the whole nation. They didn't think that the Bill of Rights was necessary. They thought that the Constitution was strong on its own and that the people would be fine without the Bill of Rights. They thought this because they felt that the checks and balances set up between the three branches would be enough to keep the central government from ever oppressing the people of America. Today, this is the basis for a liberal viewpoint. Let's talk about the Anti-Federalists. Of course, they are pretty much the opposite. They want more powerful states. They didn't want a national government and were afraid that it would become too strong and it would take over the rights of the people. They claimed that the Bill of Rights was necessary, or else the Constitution would not represent the common man. Many of these Anti-Federalists were opposed to having their states sign the Constitution and ratify it until the Bill of Rights was added. The Anti-Federalists wanted states to be able to make laws for their own citizens. They wanted their own state to be able to decide what was best for the people who lived there. A lot of the people who supported the Anti-Federalist viewpoint were farmers or small business owners. And the Anti-Federalists were the beginning of today's conservative viewpoint. So let's look at a couple key players, and these we will come back to in our next couple of lessons. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Here were two of the Federalists. John Adams, who you should know as the second president, I know you do, and Alexander Hamilton. He is a man who is known for a very interesting past, and we'll talk about him a little bit later on. The Anti-Federalists were strongly supported by James Madison, that famous Virginian, and another famous Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. I wonder if you can think of why it makes sense for two Virginians to show up as strong leaders of the Anti-Federalists. Finally, I want to share with you a graphic that helps you see today the end result of our federalism and how it has played out. We do have some powers reserved just for the states over here in the red. And then over here in the blue, these are powers that are given to the national government. Some things are shared. Examine the graphic and then you're done. You don't need to record this graphic and you can finish out your notes. Thanks so much for your hard work. I'll see you soon.